Filmmakers make films, but films make filmmakers. From blockbuster premieres to grindhouse theaters, late night cable to the local video store, there is no greater classroom for aspiring filmmakers than cinema itself. Join your host, Eric Skwarczynski, as he dives deep into the minds of legendary directors, producers, actors, and more to discover their biggest influences and to explore the impact their films are leaving behind. This is Film School. Grab your popcorn. Class is about to begin.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Film School podcast. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me on today's show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really excited to chat with you a bit. And like everybody who knows the show knows, I like to go back to the very beginning and know what made you fall in love with movies. And we actually share a very similar background in the sense that we both grew up in very fundamentalist Christian circles. And so it impeded some of our movie watching in the beginning and some of the films we'd have to catch up on later. But what was your first introduction to movies? Like, where'd you get the bite to fall in love with movies, storytelling, all the above?
I think the only non-children's programming I was allowed to watch as a kid were the first Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark.
You could do worse.
Really good movies to, watch over and over and over and over and over again. So that's kind of like where the bug was initially bit, but I wasn't really allowed to watch anything else. So there was like this whole world of forbidden fruit, that I couldn't really see and over the course of the first 15 years of my life, as I got older and got access to more things, just inhaled it all,
Right.
But yeah, was not allowed to watch a whole hell of a lot. But that just made it everything else more enticing.
Right. Yeah, no, we couldn't watch any R-rated movies. I didn't go to theaters till I turned 18. So I'm catching up. People are always like, "You've not seen The Matrix? You've not seen this?" And I'm like, dude, I got to catch up. I was like, I got a slow start in life. What was your first introduction to horror? Because my first introduction, I was probably 5th grade watching Psycho. That was my first real horror movie, which again, great first introduction to the horror genre. But what was yours? Because I know it's had a big influence on you.
I mean, weirdly enough, old Disney movies are the weird gateway drugs for a lot of people. Right. So there's all sorts of creepy, trippy shit and all the old Walt Disney cartoons. So those were kind of snuck into me a little bit at an early age. And then as I got a little older and we got a little freer from sort of the closed off fundamentalist groups, I started doing Hale stuff Gremlins and, old Joe Dante movies and old, monster flicks like the Universal films. And then it all kind of culminated with Alien when I was 11 years old that I watched. And it just changed my life and world forever. And that's kind of the movie where, everyone has that one experience that really takes hold and starts the full-blown obsession. And I think Alien was that for me, for sure.
Was it purely an obsession with watching movies? Because I know that's obviously there's a point at which movies stop being an activity and become an actual passion. I gotta watch movies. I want to check out this filmography and so on. Or was it also what sparked the passion to say I want to be on the other side of the camera trying to work on projects like this?
Yeah, the other side of the camera didn't come until later, but just the passion for the art form and just seeing as much as you can, really connected with my little kid ADHD brain. And then when you're in Florida, closed off from the world, in a weird way, it's sort of like a window out into the world,
Sure.
So and that just kind of that hook was ingrained in, as long as I can remember. Just sort of connected with it all on a super primal level. And, I guess if you want to get really psychological about it, you know, my love of like morbid stuff and subject matters, like, you know, growing up in that sort of an environment. When you tell, when I've thought about it a lot, when you tell a child, you know, as soon as they can form conscious thought, you know, that if you disobey, you're going to go burn in a lake of fire for all eternity, that probably has some weird impact on your brain.
Probably.
That you know, I don't want to say twists it, but you know, leads you down these kind of bizarre roads that other people think might be strange.
Right.
Maybe it's a coping mechanism. I don't know. You could psychoanalyze it all freaking day. But that probably played its part.
Right. I gotta ask, because like I mean, like I said, we grew up so similar, and I'm curious, like when you first started encountering some of these movies, did you have any resistance yourself to like, you know, oh, I shouldn't be watching this, or like, did you have this kind of internal thing, or was it just like full bore, like I'm into this? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think
the guilt.
I think it takes years. I think it takes years to, you know, work through that and shed yourself of that, you know, because again, it's like the forbidden fruit, you know. It's sort of like, oh, I want a little taste. All right, I gotta have another taste and another taste, and you know, part of like, you know, even when you're like, you know, for us 80s kids, like something as silly and dumb as there's like a lot of the Friday the 13th sequels, right. Like, you know, you've got like, those were, you felt, you know, rebellious watching them, you know. Right. It's silly to look back on now, but at the time, I think like part of the appeal was the fact that you weren't supposed to be watching any of this stuff. That was like where I think half the thrill came from. And I think if you talk to anybody, you know, and I don't know, like with younger generations, I don't know if it's that same appeal, because you have everything available at the touch of your fingertips. This stuff you had to like seek out and find and sneak around to watch. You know, it's not like you can just, like, any kid can just hop on their phone and push a button and watch it.
Right.
So that was like the thrill of like reading about it and discovering it and chasing it down, and, you know, doing it, you know, at like, say, slumber parties or something like that, where the adults have gone to bed. Like that was the appeal of all of it. So I'm wondering if, you know, the newer generations have that same thrill that we get out of there, that we got back in the day doing that. It's almost like ritualistic, you know?
Yeah, I think I mean, you know, I grew up in a different decade. So like, I grew up in the 2000s, you know, going to high school. So it's like, you know, it's for me, it looked different, but it was still that same, like, my parents aren't going to buy this movie. They're not going to purchase this. You know, it was like the one friend in the group who like had unlimited access to download whatever he wanted, who's like, let's watch Saw on the way to a basketball tournament, you know? And I remember, it's funny, one of my friends who grew up in the same kind of environment talks about that. He's like, he's like, I remember one time we went to this basketball tournament and we all watched the entire Saw series, like all through the night, and then like didn't sleep at all that night and just went back into playing. And I was like, did we all have the same exact experience? Like, was that all like, we have the friend that downloads Saw, you get to watch all the movies, and then it starts like, here's Texas Chainsaw, here's this, and you're chasing this high, trying to find all these different movies. What was the first time that you did get that bug to like actually get involved making movies? Because that is a big jump, like to go from consuming to saying like, okay, how did they do that? How does Ridley Scott make Alien? How does Joe Dante make this movie? How does Sam Raimi create, you know, Evil Dead? Like that's a big change in perspective.
I mean, I you know, Alien was like the touch point where I like went deep diving into, you know, magazines like Cinefex, Fangoria, all that kind of stuff, and you know, this was before the internet was around. Oh, and then leading into the early days of the internet. So like you kind of like had to really go down crazy rabbit holes and aggressively chase all this kind of information. But that's kind of like from that point on, you know, I wanted to know how the sausage was made, specifically with like monster movies and stuff. And, you know, George Lucas and Spielberg and all these, and Dante and all these influences, sort of like the Amblin age in the monster movie age, and especially during like practical effects during like the hype and the heyday of it. So yeah, it was just this weird desire to like learn how everything was done. Didn't like have any major aspirations to work in the business, oddly enough, because I didn't have the tools around me to even learn any of this. Like I didn't have video cameras, and I in a small southern town, you just didn't have any of these resources. So I didn't figure out it wasn't until I picked up like cameras and editing software when I went to school that I got bit by the filmmaking bug of like, oh my God, these are things and tools and I'm playing with them and now I can't do anything else. Like that's when it was just exploring that. That's when I knew that like, this is all that I can really do.
Right. Was school what took you from Florida to LA?
I didn't come to LA. I went to Savannah, Georgia, because I know I wanted to pursue the arts. I just didn't know where.
What aspect of it?
Yeah. I mean, I did what in this living in the South, I had like pencil and paper. So I drew a lot, was into comics and drawing comics and things like that. But without that gear, I didn't know if I had that, skill set in me to do it until I started playing around with the equipment. So I went to Savannah College of Art and Design just to pursue arts and do different studies and just see where I wanted to go. That was what it was all about, was finding myself and what career path I wanted to take. But like freshman year, when I went in and picked up a camera for the first time and learned Final Cut Pro and Avid, I was like, all right, this is it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, when I hear you tell your story, usually you're starting with LA, moving there, like, getting your first work. And how did that kind of all fall into place? Because I mean, it's hard enough to break into the industry when you already are connected, when you already are in a place like LA that's hyper competitive, but like moving there from the other side of the country with no connections, like how did you go about forming that relationship with Daniel, working on, that first documentary? Like how did that all kind of fall into place?
So I actually, I wish I had moved out to LA way sooner. I always feel like I'm just like, I'm a late bloomer and I arrive at things way too late.
Would you have done that as opposed to film school? Like just come and
I would have done that. I would have done a year or two of film school and then I would have moved out to LA.
Okay.
Had I not done that. I stayed all 4 years in film school and then I kicked around the South for 2 years after that. Because I didn't know where I wanted to move. I didn't want to move to LA originally. So I visited New York and LA and Chicago and stuff, trying to figure out where would be the best place to go. And then just, arrived at the conclusion like, well, LA is the only place to go. So, for my line of work, because I also pursued it with very realistic expectations. I didn't, a lot of like the big wigs and the people who, are in positions of power in Los Angeles are people who were born into the industry. A lot of people working in the industry have parents who worked in the industry, and they kind of have that leg up. And I came in with nothing, with zero connections. So I knew that, as much as I liked filmmaking, directing, all that kind of stuff, that like I wasn't going to be able to make a living at it. So I needed something else in the industry to support that while I pursue that. And editing, I figured out I was really good at. And it's like, okay, this is a high in demand job that I can go do. So my express goal was, wherever I moved, was to make my living as an editor, because I knew that's what paid the bills. Making a living as a director, nobody makes a living directing anymore, unless you're like one of like the elite,
one of the ones we could name on one hand. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, nobody else does. It's like acting, directing and acting are the same thing. It's like it's almost impossible to make a living at it. You have to have some sort of support. So yeah, I moved out here sort of pursuing editing and working on like independent directing, at the same time. So I had moved out when I moved out to LA, because I was sort of a nerd and hanging out online a lot with fellow horror fanatics. I got roped into this failed enterprise called the Horror Channel, which a whole bunch of us got sucked into. That sort of basically led to a website, to a channel that never launched, but that website was like, doing journalism stuff. So I was like working in journalism, writing reviews and doing interviews and stuff like that. Stuff I didn't really like doing or had no aspirations for, but it was a good way to meet people and like connect. And so that way, and I was doing on the side, I had racked up credit card debt buying a Mac computer so I could edit from home, basically. I was doing internships and working crappy jobs at like Toys R Us and setting up like, whatever I could get to make money. Yeah. And then through sort of like the journalism thing, I started cutting like demo reels from home for actors. There was people like David Hess, who I was like, I think he was my first client. So I started doing like making, what I could, cutting actors' demo reels together and moving into like local TV commercials and just doing whatever weird, odd jobs that I could, until a friend of mine, who was a fellow journalist, Stacey Lane Wilson, had recommended me to Dan Farrens, who was working on a documentary at the time called His Name Was Jason, which is about Friday the 13th. Right. So I got on board with him on that to edit like bonus feature material for that release. And the documentary didn't go so well. And Dan and I were kind of like, I was kind of on Dan's side through that experience, and the two of us kind of like came out the other end going like, you want to work together? And so we spent years doing behind the scenes bonus features for Blu-rays and DVDs.
What was so miserable about Crystal Lake Memories? Was it just a lot of tinkering from the people producing it, or what went so wrong with that?
I don't want to like go into the details, but there was just a lot of conflicts and stuff, and at the end of the day, I think Crystal Lake Memories, which it was sort of like a lot of that was refashioned into with like, was more along the lines of like what he wanted to do.
Right.
But it was like just the time crunch in general was horrendous. Sure. But it was kind of neat to be in that world and finally like do stuff with horror and meet all the Friday the 13th people and stuff like that. And that, the good thing that came out of that was it kind of propelled the two of us into documentary making. And that led to Never Sleep Again, and, us basically becoming this sort of like independent entity. And for those final years of like, really great Blu-ray bonus content, it's sort of a dying thing now. Scream Factory and a couple other ones are still in the game, but we were just doing that. I was making my living for years doing documentary stuff, and that's how Never Sleep Again came about, because I told Dan, I was like, we don't need anybody else. That we've got this Nightmare on Elm Street remake coming out, why don't we just do it ourselves? And so we did. We just kind of took together all our resources and did that and made this behemoth of a thing.
Right.
And when it came out, like, we didn't have any idea what to expect. And that was the thing that really changed our lives at the time. So,
yeah, I mean, both of them, Crystal Lake Memories and Never Sleep Again are both kind of seminal. I mean, it's like not debated. I don't think, like, those are the two definitive horror documentaries. Like, I don't think I've ever seen someone say they didn't like them. I'm sure if I scoured Letterboxd, I could find them, but for the most part, everybody who's a horror fan, even people that don't necessarily like Friday 13th, or even, aren't the biggest, like, those documentaries, just as from a filmmaking perspective, are super fascinating. And for a 4-hour plus documentary, it rockets by. Like, it's crazy. Like, pitching it to somebody is the hardest part. Like, okay, hey, do you want to watch, this happened with my wife, who's not a huge horror fan. I was like, hey, there's this documentary. It's like 3 hours long about Friday the 13th. What? And then we get like, 10 minutes in and she's like, shh, I'm watching, like it's super, super interesting filmmaking. And was that something like when you first started working on those, were you guys being commissioned to create a lot of stuff like that and then decided, hey, let's do this on our own with Never Sleep Again? Or was it something where like all of those were, let's go shoot it and then pitch it to, an Anchor Bay or to, fill in the blank, whoever it would be?
Yeah, we were going, as now my memory is a little jumbled because it all kind of blurs together, but
well, because you made a thing like Never Sleep Again, your brain is permanently probably like damaged of some section of it.
That documentary damn near killed me. But as I remember it, we were doing Friday the 13th like bonus features for Paramount for a year. We spent a couple of years doing the entire series for their releases. And so and that's kind of like over time, like, yes, that's what we were doing. Because I remember specifically like Paramount were shipping boxes of film reels like from their archives to my apartment. So I think we worked for like 2 years on all of those movies. That's kind of how I was making my living. And then when, the opportunity, I think we were talking about pitching an Elm Street documentary, but nobody was interested. And so then we kind of came up with the idea of let's just do it and then sell it after the fact. So it was a very scrappy guerrilla thing. And when we started out, we didn't have anybody involved except for Heather Langenkamp. And then, 104 interviews later, we had this 4-hour thing that we had never really set out to make, but it just kind of became that as we were making it.
Yeah. Do you wish, like looking back, I mean, you probably don't want to return to it at all, but, do you wish going back that you would have been able to include more from the remake? Or do you wish that, or...
No, it was a very conscious decision not to really talk about the remake. And I'm kind of glad we didn't. And I don't think I'd really, I don't think the remake is, really remembered much at all these days. I don't know if it'd be worth going back to do anything specifically on that. And Nightmare on Elm Street's sort of been in limbo, ever since. And one day it'll come back in some form, these franchises.
I think sooner rather than later there'll be something, because it's been too long. I'm one of the, please don't hang up, but I'm one of the people that I have fond opinions about the remake, which I say through gritted teeth. But that was actually my first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which throws you through a weird loop because, that to me, it's the same thing. I was just talking, I interviewed Joe Lynch Friday and I was like saying, my introduction to Texas Chainsaw was Platinum Dunes, Jason Voorhees was, Jason Voorhees, I watched part 4, I believe, first, or part 3. But, Nightmare on Elm Street, like, my introduction to the series was the remake, which I liked enough to go back and watch the originals. And, now my favorites jumble every time I watch the series, 2 or 3 or 1 or, and, but yeah, I have fond thoughts about it, but I think it was, regardless of thoughts on the film, it had an impossible task because New Nightmare was so close to that time and was such a good send off from Wes Craven. Anything would have been just target practice. Like, even if they had done the right thing, whatever that would be, if they had been not faithful enough, they would have got killed. If they would have been too faithful, they would have got killed. And we only know Robert in that. It's not like Friday 13th where it's like, okay, you have Kane or you have CJ Graham or you have Halloween, we've got 30 different timelines. It doesn't even matter now. Like, pick your own version you want to watch. It was an untouchable kind of franchise at that point that was specifically him. So it's a tricky place to come in from. I'm kind of curious, not to derail the whole conversation, where would you like to see it go if they did bring it back or remake it?
Peter Jackson had a really great concept that I'm
so glad you said that.
Yeah, I think his concept of like Freddy is a decrepit old thing that like people, the kids on Elm Street, beat the shit out of in their dreams, like, and then having him like manage to accidentally kill one of these kids and get enough power back to come back for like one more round. Like, I think that would be the movie that I want to see. I haven't seen his script or read it or anything like that, but I think that's the concept, to do one more with Robert Englund and do it as him as old Freddy would be, obviously he can't do the whole freaking, and he can't be Dream Warriors Freddy anymore, but I think you could go back to that original sort of like lurker, with like an aged, Freddy, like basically like coming back to life. Like if you were to do another one, that's what I would personally do, is go back to that concept. Because I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
That's as far as where to take it from there. I mean, it's hard because it's like, it's difficult to do a really good Freddy Krueger without Robert Englund. It's not a character. It's not a role that's easily replaceable. It's so synonymous with him. So I think he could probably have one more left in him, but it's these stuff is always entangled in legal and development. Usually they just run out the clock trying to figure out what to do. Friday the 13th the same way. It's like, who knows when anything's going to come from that. So I don't know.
It's such a bummer, because that's a series I'd love to see rip. Like, I make one of those a year, like Blumhouse or somebody, just make a Friday the 13th every year. You win some, lose some, just crank them out. Like, I think that'd be awesome.
Be great. Yeah.
No, totally agree with the Nightmare on Elm Street, because that was the one section of the documentary where like that there was a couple ideas that were mentioned, and I can't remember any of them, which speaks to probably how good some of the ideas were, because there were some freaky weird ideas that they had. But Peter Jackson's idea, of that, I think is so smart, and I would have loved to have seen him do that during that time period, like off the heels of like a Dead Alive, or Brain Dead, depending what part of the world you're from. I think that would have been fascinating to see what he would have done with a no holds barred kind of movie like that.
It would have been great. But yeah, like as far as the Elm Street franchise in general, like if it stays dead, personally, I'm fine with it. I don't feel like these franchises need to be, exist as IPs forever. I think it's fine. If this is all we have, great, fine. Make another franchise. I'd rather see more franchises birthed than dragged stuff out. It's like, and it's different when it's like, like the Universal monsters are different. They're sort of more timeless figures that go way, way back. Even before filmmaking was born. So yeah, I think there's way better things that you could do than make another Texas Chainsaw movie. I mean,
coming soon.
Really,
I
don't like, if people want to make them and make a lot of money off of them, God bless them. But it's like, personally, it's not something that I have any interest in seeing. You're never gonna top Tobe Hooper's original anyway.
Before we transition out of this, I wanted to ask just really quick, like, where did the stop motion, like, kind of animation come in? Because like, obviously you had these kind of claymation pieces for Freddy Krueger in the transition. Was that something you brought to the table? Was that from Daniel? Because I know like Slow Poisoner has a little bit of that stop motion claymation kind of animation as well. Where did that come from? Was that from you?
I forget. I honestly don't remember what kicked it off. I just remember we met this guy, Michael Granberry, and he was referred to us through a friend who worked on Robot Chicken. And, we were like, at some point, I don't remember where the genesis of it was, but Dan and I were like, it would be so cool to have stop motion segments. So Dan found this guy, went to his house, and he said, oh, I already built the Elm Street house for you, and it was there. He'd already built it like almost overnight.
Jeez.
And presented it. And then he started churning out like a shot a day for it. And we were just like, our jaws were on the floor. It was like, this guy is incredible. Same guy who did the Hot Rod Worm music video. Yeah. I've worked with him. I've you know, I don't think I can afford him now, but he's kind of gone on to do all sorts of incredible work. And Michael Granberry's just a genius. I can't shower him with enough praise, because he's just, what he does and the time that it takes him to do it's just unbelievable.
Right. Well, taking the pivot from behind the scenes of all these different films to stepping into the role of working on, you know, scripted, you know, formatted films and television, you know, after doing Never Sleep Again and kind of like the mic drop moments of that, and you know, Crystal Lake Memories, all these different films, did you just feel like you did what you wanted to do as far as behind the scenes stuff? It was time to do some original work, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it was cool to do all that stuff, but it's you know, it doesn't pay well, and it doesn't do a good job at keeping the lights on unless you get like hit with a ridiculous amount of work. And at the time, you know, after a while, you just get sick of talking heads. You get sick of cutting together people's faces, and you're like, all right, fuck this. I want to move on and, you know, like really do stuff that I'm like super passionate about. Not that those weren't passion projects, but, you know, after you've done like your 37th Scream Factory bonus feature, it's sort of like, all right, this is becoming old hat and I'm bored now. You know, I did it like up until even a couple of years ago. Like, I think the last thing that I did was like, I would, in between seasons of television, you know, when I had nothing going on, if something like that fell in my lap, you know, through Michael Felsher's company or whatever, I would be happy to just cut a few things or take on a few things. The last thing I did was, I think, the Vampires Blu-ray a couple of years ago for Scream Factory, like, helped produce and cut some of those, and went up to Vegas and interviewed James Woods and all that kind of stuff. So it was a neat thing to just do on the side but at this point I'm like, you know, I want to pursue other things for sure. And there's only like a couple of games in town that do it, and a couple of guys who still do this kind of work, and they do it brilliantly. And, you know, and hats off to them. Like, I want to see them keep going and doing this stuff. But yeah, like, as far as like documentaries go, not super interested in them, especially once you fall in the world of scripted stuff. It's like, okay, this is where I wanted to be all along. So more than happy to let other people do that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, getting into the scripted stuff, like, I got to talk about Tales of Halloween, because I think that's, I was watching your segment, This Means War, just last night, revisiting it, and it's, you know, it's such a well-directed, like, it's a really short, super sharp, well-directed segment. Where'd the idea for that kind of come in? And, you know, I mean, how'd you knock that out? Because I'm assuming you didn't have a ton of time or a ton of money to put that together. You know, what was kind of the process that led to that?
No, yeah. Now, I mean, in retrospect, we had to shave it way down from what it originally was, because we didn't have the time or the money, mostly time, to make it what we had kind of conceived it to be. But because building, you know, 2 giant houses up with yard displays in 2 days is, that's tough. But I think the genesis was, we had a couple ideas. Skip and I were working together as a team at the time, and we were kind of kicking around ideas. And then the idea hit me to have the idea of neighbors competing with their Halloween displays. And that's something that the producers liked. And then Skip came up with the idea of like, well, what if they're old school versus new school? What if it's like Universal, like Forey Ackerman Famous Monsters Universal Lover versus like the Rob Zombie Fango generation, you know?
Right.
So those two things melded together, and that's kind of what birthed This Means War, to like kind of address the schism, that kind of like schism between the old monster kids and the new monster kids, which you kind of still see, like the older, like the Famous Monsters generations, like those guys, like the Joe Dantes and the Bill Malones and all those guys, like, you know, they're kind of their own tight knit crew, you know. And, you know, people my generation, you know, like, you know, the Freddys, the Jasons, the Chuckies, all those, like, that's sort of its own weird clique, you know. So yeah, it's sort of, and there's a lot of, like, you know, friendly debates that come up from time to time still.
Right.
So,
well, especially now, I mean, Rob Zombie's tackling an old school horror property, and a lot of people don't know what to think. There's a lot of mixed emotions surrounding that right now. But it's kind of the perfect blend, I think, of those two personality types.
I'm rooting for him. I'm hoping I'm hoping he does it great. I know he's a massive Monsters fan, and if he can marry the two, you know, types together, you know, perfect.
Well, the pictures and images and stuff look amazing. The sets and costumes, and, you know, I'm excited for it. And I think, you know, I know Zombie's a polarizing figure, but I think when he hits it out of the park. Like, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of good films out there. So curious to see how it comes out. But speaking of directors, I mean, working in an anthology with 11 other directors, how did you guys survive and not end up killing each other by the end of the project? Almost didn't survive, or
no, we're all still friends, and we all still keep in touch. But it was an exhausting experience. It was just, and everyone was sort of in their own corner, you know, focused. The really difficult thing was that it was like one shoot after the one segment after the other. So there wasn't a lot of time. There was no like days off in between. And so our shoot was scheduled later. And so some of our key crew members had just done like 7 other shorts. So a lot of people were like super burned out at that point. Yeah. And that was really difficult. It was just sort of, again, it's sort of like that was done in such a fast haze. I was taking literally days off because I was working on season 1 of The Flash as an assistant editor, making my living on that. Right. And I was literally taking a couple of days off to go shoot that and then go back to work. Yeah. So it was like, you know, at the time I had a kid, you know, a newborn kid, and it was just so much all at once. Like, I just remember that being a very stressful period of my life. And when I had gotten through Tales of Halloween, I was like kind of just more happy that I got out through the other end of it, as opposed to, like, you know, I'm happy. I'm happy for the experience. Happy to have done it. Learned a lot doing it, but it was definitely one of those experiences. You come out the other end and just like, all right, I survived this. You know, as opposed to being like, yay.
Is there ever a project where you can come out of it going, yay, that was awesome? Or do you think all of, like, any type of filmmaking, you know, thing you take on is going to leave with like, okay, I need some time to have retrospect to really see it for what it is?
You're never not going to feel that way, you know, about me. You know, it's, everyone will tell you, it's like, you know, it's not, art is never finished, it's abandoned, you know. It's just, you know, at what point are you happy with it being abandoned? So you're never going to be you're never, like, that's the thing. You're always going to be chasing that itch. You're never going to be satisfied. And let's face it, if you are completely satisfied, you're doing something wrong. You have the wrong mindset, because you know, confidence is, you know, the death of creativity, I think. So when you're content with something, if you're fully content with something, it's like there's no point anymore. It kind of takes away the drive. So yeah, but you do have experiences where you're like, you walk away and you're like, I had a good experience and I'm happy with the finished product. Right. So that is totally possible. Like on the show that I'm working on right now, which is called Legends of Tomorrow, I like the last couple episodes that I've done, I've had that sort of reaction, of like, after you're done beating yourself up in post for what you could have done better, and that, and then it gets taken out of your hands and other people take it home. But it's like, and it's that's like, working on that show is like something that I can look back on and go like, okay, I'm happy with my work and I had a great, wonderful time doing it and learned a lot, and this is great and I can't wait to do it again. Yeah. So that's sort of like, that's when things are super positive and you feel just overall like a sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. Working on shows, I wanted to ask this before we move into our random round here, like working on shows like Flash or these other DC properties, which it's incredible with the budgets I'm sure they have on CW shows. Like some of the effects on the Flash are crazy, and it's pretty wild, like the scale. Like I couldn't have imagined, growing up, like having like, King Shark brought to life, in a show. Like it's kind of crazy that we're in this time period, at least not not being a guy in a rubber suit, that doesn't look very good on an old TV show. But working on shows like that are so, you've got very definitive source material. You've got showrunners who've already created the look of the show. Like, do you feel the ability to put like your own creative stamp onto that? Like whether you're directing like Legends of Tomorrow, whether you're doing editing on projects like The Flash, do you feel like it's creatively fulfilling in the same way, even though it's not necessarily your own original kind of IP?
Yeah, it's definitely creatively fulfilling. They do, editorial, depending on the show, maybe a little less.
Right.
But because you're working with all these IPs and a lot of people, or, you're answering to a lot of people, but you still put your creative stamp on it. You still find the tone and, there's plenty of, TV that I've edited in DC that I'm like very happy and can see my stamp on the finished product. More so on Legends of Tomorrow, which is a very freeing TV show than a normal comic book show. That's sort of its own weird thing that kind of isn't beholden to as many rules and regulations, and they kind of just let you go nuts. Yeah, like I mean, some of my directing for TV, it's weird because you're not, you don't have the same sort of ownership over an episode that you would do if you were directing a movie that you started yourself. Like you're the odd person out coming into a machine that's already moving and can kind of function with or without you. But when you adapt to that environment and you have sort of like all these crazy cool tools at your disposal, and if you're lucky enough to be on a show that will kind of leave you alone or trust you to just do your thing, you can come away with a tremendous amount of like creative fulfillment, like, sure, this is great, totally like wonderful, this is the way that I want it to be. So, and you're well supported by everybody, and you have a chain that you have to answer to, but if that chain of people is cool, it just makes the experience so great.
Sure.
So yeah.
No, that's awesome.
But different, very like they're very different things, but also not, if that makes any sense. Right. From doing like a television show or doing your own sort of indie movie, it's like there's a lot that's so similar, and so many tools that you take with you from one to the other, and other times like just complete night and day. Right. But I can't, like at this point, I can't say that one is better than the other, to be honest. I'm happy doing both.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing some insights. I'm going to move us here into our kind of rapid round here. And these are never end up being very rapid. So I'll try to move us through quick because there's a lot of thought-provoking questions here. But first of all, what is a film that you think is the best representation of you as a creator?
Oh, Jesus. Wow. I mean, I can't specifically say one film, but if I would just say, like, stuff like Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, Brain Dead, those are movies, the Raimi Jackson and Joe Dante sort of, whimsical, anarchic, creature features are super in my wheelhouse. That speaks most to my sensibility and sense of humor, and kind of like this, I guess, I don't know. It's just like, it just pushes all the happy buttons in my soul,
Right. Right.
So whenever, like, yeah, just getting, like, that's sort of the stuff that connected with me, like, deep down the most, as far as, like, hey, I would love to do something like this. So I think I can't point to anything like one specific one. That's too hard.
Right. What is a movie that your fans would be surprised that you enjoy? So people who know you as the guy who loves Evil Dead and Dead Alive and all these sorts of films. Is there a movie that you love that just totally comes out of the blue? Like, I can't believe that.
One of my top 5 favorite movies is Defending Your Life by Albert Brooks.
That's crazy. That just got mentioned Friday by Joe. Yeah, yeah. He mentioned that being a favorite.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite movies, and I love Albert Brooks in general. But yeah, that's not something that you would probably expect your average Fangoria reader to pull out and go,
right.
Hey.
Yeah. What is the best decade of film history?
It's so cliche. I mean, the 70s were probably the undisputed king.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything better than the 70s. I mean, a lot of people are tempted to say the 80s because the 80s were great.
Right. Yeah.
But, and that's kind of where all the practical art forms reached their peak, So that's an easy thing to say, but that's only through the lens of nostalgia. Right. If you want to talk about quality and craftsmanship and influence and, the films being as good as they've ever been, it's 100% the 70s.
Yeah.
That's when it's like all the Mavericks took over, changed all the rules. If you read Easy Rider's Raging Bulls, that's sort of the book that completely defines that era. Like, that's the best filmmaking, I think, period. 80s, as great as it was, and we got a lot of magic out of the 80s, and it may have left a bigger impression on us, that's the beginning of where it got all that started to get commercialized, right?
Yeah.
And went into the sort of, the bigger, glossier MTV generation, that kind of has continued through up until now,
Right.
But filmmaking, 100%, the 70s is the, like, definitive era of movie.
Yeah. 100% agree.
Yeah.
No, that's why I like asking the best, because it makes people go, they want to say 80s, because I think it's everybody's default, because it is like Spielberg, but you think about all those films, but like the 70s, I mean, even Spielberg, I would argue Spielberg's best films were the 70s, like the movies he was putting out during that time, Close Encounters, Jaws. I mean, it was a golden time, and it is where things were able to push to the limits in a way. I do understand Tarantino's argument, like the 80s is 50s part 2 in a lot of ways. Like, it started getting very commercial and a lot of sanitized movies near the end, but it's hard. Like, I would say late 70s to early 80s would be my jam right there. I know you say you don't like remakes, but if you were given the green light to remake any film, what would you choose and why? And I'll expand this question and say, if you could make a remake or a sequel to any film, what would you choose and why?
man, what would I like to remake? I had films that I had wanted to remake, but then they were remade and then remade back. So I don't. Just trying
They've
to think
had
of like
4
what's
remakes
left.
since you've decided to do it. Yeah.
Right. I always want to do like a sequel to Killer Clowns. Or I mean, if somebody said, "Hey, what if you could have any sequel in the world?" I would pick an Alien movie, obviously. But remake. That's a tough one. And it's I feel like 5 years ago I would have had one like right off the top of my head that I could have given you.
I think it's tricky because we tend to think of our favorite movies, but then it's like, well, why would I remake that? I think it would be more something you watch where you're like, either it could have been, or with technology now, or with, knowing what we know now, or taking it into this time period, we could do something with it. But
yeah. I mean, if I would definitely remake like an older, much older movie. I mean, it might be cool. It would be cool to do a modern Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That could be that. I mean, and there have been, but they didn't. Because I guess anybody could do one if they really wanted to.
Right.
But I think if you were given Tim Burton level resources to do, a modern reimagining of Dr.
with the production design and really go balls out,
go nuts, go full Guillermo del Toro on that thing. I think it'd be awesome.
That's a really interesting choice. I'm glad we pushed through, because I was gonna just be like, oh well, you don't have one, but I think that's a really interesting choice. You could probably do a lot too, even with like CG now and stuff too. Like there's probably a lot of cool optical things you could do that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
What's the best piece of advice you'd give to an aspiring filmmaker who's listening to this? No pressure, but this could change their life.
Don't be afraid to fail, because you're going to fail again and again and again and again and again and again, often for years or decades. But if you stay the course, it's totally worth it.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show. I really do appreciate it, and taking some time. It was awesome. Love getting to chat with you, and huge fan of your work in the documentary space. And like I said, even your segments and things, I'm excited to see what you work on next. And maybe you could do your remake pretty soon. So
you never know. That's the weird thing about this town. You never know what the hell it's going to throw at you.
Well, you just officially announced it, so this is out in the world now. Go. It's going to happen.
World exclusive.
But awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Film School podcast. If you appreciated the content on the show, don't forget to leave a 5-star review and hit subscribe so you won't miss a single episode.